Good evening, everybody, and welcome to part of our continuing series of Know Your City here in Waltham. I'm delighted to have Diana Young here doing not a repeat, an update of a program she did late last year on the city charter. Last year, a group of leaguers decided to look at the city charter and came up with some interesting information that we're delighted to share with you. Diana, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Anyway, today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the division of power between the Commonwealth and cities. And then we're going to talk specifically about the Waltham City Charter. And then we'll talk about some provisions in other city charters. And finally, a comparison of several cities. So let me get the presentation up. So anyway, one of the things we didn't spend much time on, but I've added some additional material, is the school committee. We started by looking at the city council and the mayor's office, and then the general terms that are in the city charter. The team, I just want to make sure people know who did the work. Shelley Drowns was our chair, and Mary Sue Simiowski was a member. Deb, I always have a hard time with Deb's name, Gudmundsson, and me. And we spent quite a while trying to figure out how best to understand a city charter. So why do we look at it? Well, one of the reasons we're looking at it is in order to understand how the city operates, it helps to understand what how the city is organized. And basically the charter is like a constitution. It's like the US Constitution, it's only a few pages long, but the way it's used involves many statutes and other entities that are not necessarily laid out in the Constitution, but the power was laid out to allow it. And one of the other reasons is a lot of times you get the impression the charter is an obstacle to change. And I think when you see some of the terms, you're going to see it doesn't really give a lot of specificity. And so it may not be as much of an obstacle as it appears. One of the main parts of that you have to understand in dealing with a city charter is to understand how much power a city has in general. And the bottom line is the Supreme Court said the states have the power. They can then give power on to municipal entities, but only as the state allows it. And Massachusetts has had a constitution since before the US Constitution was done. It's actually the oldest written constitution still in practice in this world, which is rather interesting. It was, by the way, it was written by John Adams. And the format of it is not unlike the US Constitution. But getting back to this, the power is coming from the state. So Massachusetts then makes a grant of power to local communities. And as we'll see in a few minutes, the state lays out some of the basic charter options that a city can choose from. And it determines the areas where the community can have control or affect change. It has certain powers that it keeps to itself. And some of the ones that are important are the rights to enact private or civil law. So for example, Waltham can't have a rule that lays out rules about contracts or regulates private or commercial behavior, except to the extent of the property that people have. The city does not have the right to impose or determine what a felony is in this city or to imprison anybody. And also, the state keeps the right to dispose of parkland. So if a city wanted to get rid of its park and maybe develop it, They have to go to the legislature and meet certain statutory requirements. These are specific things that the state has said, we're keeping. They also give some limited powers in some other areas. So, for example, the city runs local elections. And except for special elections that might occur because of somebody leaving office before the end of their term, the state sets the schedule and the general rules. And it's the state that requires the rules for how you do absentee balloting, things like that. But the city then runs the election, picks the wardens, picks the machines that we're using, does all the work. Another thing that they give kind of a limited benefit to the cities is the right to levy or assess taxes. So we set some of the rates, for example, property taxes, but the state determines what kinds of taxes that we can collect. So we can do real estate taxes and property taxes, but there are rules around how much, et cetera, things like Prop 2.5, what portion we can have for meals tax. And they also lay out how much we can borrow and how we can borrow money, which I think is useful. Some of the things that you have to think about, but you probably know already, is areas where the state imposes some control. For example, it's the state that laid out that affordable housing, the goal should be to get to 10% of your housing being affordable. And they applied and created the rule 40B, which gets around city rules around zoning if you don't meet that target. Another one that's rather interesting is the fire and building codes. And kind of saw that in action a few years back. After the Cooper Street fire, there were a lot of people were pretty upset about how fast those buildings went up. And I remember a group of people got together and they petitioned the city to require that when these buildings were rebuilt, that they be built out of steel rather than the wooden construction that was allowed from the second floor up. Unfortunately, the petition was to the wrong people. The city had no authority after they had issued the permit, which they had done before the fire, to change that construction. Wooden frame construction for those buildings is allowed by state law. And so the petition went to the city council, but it didn't really matter. The only place it could have mattered would have been if it went to the state. Another area is property taxes. The city collects property tax and it sets the rates, but the state determines what kind of properties you can assess the tax on, and it limits the number of categories. So for example, there's residential property, like, private homes, there's commercial property, and there's industrial property. Industrial would be more manufacturing property. But I know there was a point which there was some discussion about how do we perhaps make it easier for small businesses to get to develop in the city. Can we do a separate rate for small commercial operations so they pay less per value than, say, bigger properties? And it's not doable. The state only allows those three categories, and we'd have to get the state to change the rules. One other thing that's interesting is local elections. With the exception of one form of a city, which we'll get to in a minute, the state mandates that the elections are nonpartisan, which is very different than most states. So when we have an election, you don't know the party of the people that are running. not unless they decide to tell you. But so you don't have Democrats running against Republicans in the local elections in this state. They do allow the cities to choose a form of government from among 6 plans. There's plans A through F, which I'll show you in a minute. They also give the city the right to home rule, so that the city could make changes in the city charter, and it's allowed to make changes in the city ordinances. There was a time before home rule when that wasn't allowed, and I'll mention that again in a minute. So these are the optional forms of city government that are available to us. The first is a Plan A, which is elected, but all of the city councilors are at large, and there is no city manager or a chief administrative officer, which a few cities have used. For example, Chelsea is run by a city manager. The second one, which is what Waltham is a Plan B, and that's where you have an elected mayor, and you have at-large and by ward councilors. So that meets what we do. There's the third one is one that's not in place anywhere in the state, as far as I can tell. And that's a Form C, where you elect 5 commissioners, and one is of those commissioners is the mayor, and they run the general administrative stuff. One of the commissioners might be the head of public works and some of the major departments that you see in cities. But as I mentioned, nobody's using that. I don't know if anybody ever did, but it's not a form that you see. The other one is where Form D, where you elect a city council, and then the city council chooses the mayor. And in the case like that, the mayor is not responsible for that much of the administration of the city. And so you would have a city manager. And I believe we have 1D. Peabody up on the North Shore uses that form of government. Then you have Form E, where the mayor is not from the city council, but is chosen by the city council. And again, you have a city manager. And I think I found 1E. Looks like Cambridge, or no, Lowell was a Form E. I'm not sure about Cambridge. The last one also is one that's not used. It's where you have an elected mayor, and then you have at-large and by ward councilors, but political parties are allowed. And again, nobody in this state has it. There was an old list that I was able to find that defined every single city and town as to what form of government it had. There are some towns, for example, Woburn, which is one of the ones that we looked at, where it doesn't fit exactly into any of these forms. I suspect it's because it predates the statute that lays out these forms of government, but they've gotten a special approval from the legislature. And so there are other cities and towns that do not have, in effect, a specific one of these plans, but probably have many of the attributes, but the legislature had in the past approved them. I wanted to mention a little bit about home rule, because it's a concept that you hear about, and we had the hardest time trying to really fully understand it. It varies a lot from state to state. But what was happening was initially the state, everything that local communities wanted to do, they had to go to the state legislature. And it drove the state legislature, I think, crazy with a lot of small stuff for which they had very little information, knowledge, or for that matter, interest. For example, when they had a discussion about going to home rule, there were a couple of things that were mentioned as things that had come to the legislature that year. One was Nahant wanted to establish certain parking violations, and the legislature had to rule on it. Another was a small town wanted to buy storm weather and weather gear, clothing and boots for their public works employees, and that had to go to the legislature. So home rule allows cities and towns to take some responsibility for a lot of the local concerns. And it's been in place since 1967, so we really don't see it very often. One thing, though, that was interesting was when Waltham last changed its charter. That was back in 1986. They could have gone with home rule, but they didn't. And we don't know why. We checked with the mayor. She was not sure. She said to check with Pat Azadi, in the solicitor's office. And it turned out Pat had started working at the city right after law school, but then left for a few years and then came back to the city. And it was during the time she was away that the city changed its charter. So we still don't know why the city went to the state to get approval for its charter, but it did. And I think it might be because the home rule definitions in Massachusetts are a little bit difficult. And there have been articles written about the fact that it's kind of not as straightforward as it is in other states. Now let's spend a little time on Waltham's charter. As we said earlier, it's Plan B, where the legislature and the city government are composed of a mayor and a city council. And you have the council elected partly at large and partly from wards within the city. Now the city charter basically is a framework. As I said earlier, it's a little bit like the constitution of a city. It defines the structure, the executive, the legislative, the school board. It delineates how much power each group has. And then it has some additional provisions on elections and some interesting things that I wanted to mention around citizen petitions, places where the citizenry can actually try to affect what government does. And then also how to change the charter. The charter itself is really small. And if I can show this, am I on the screen, Annette?
Yes, you are. You're over on the side, but we can see.
Yeah, so this is the charter. It's 15 pages. The ordinance is hundreds. And this is an old version, so it's probably even more now. So the ordinances are where the details are. The actual charter doesn't say a whole lot in detail, but it does lay out the structure, and I think when we go through some of the provisions, it'll make a little more sense. So anyway, as you probably all know, we've got 15 counselors, 9 ward counselors, and 6 at-large counselors with terms of 2 years and no term limits. And that the city council elects its own president every year. So fairly straightforward. The charter lays out things like the quorum rules as to how many members are needed to pass a question. Certain questions are majority, some are 2/3 majority. But one important issue is it's not the majority of those that happen to be voting or there in the chamber. It's the majority of the 15. So you have to get 8 votes, even if there's only 10 people there for a regular situation. And you've got to get 10 votes if you're doing something like a special permit or overruling the mayor's veto, even if there's only 11 in the room. So the charter, though, gives the council the ability to set its own meeting schedule and its rules. And in fact, you don't see it often, but the city council has a fairly extensive rule book that I was able to see one time, and it lays out a lot of the procedural things. The charter also lays out the rules for pre-publication, before you're going to have a special permit or an ordinance. You will find in the charter a requirement to publish the information in the newspaper. Getting more and more difficult because newspapers, our newspaper used to be 5 days a week, now it's down to 1 day a week. And it's not clear that by publish they mean it has to be in a print document, but that's the way it's been interpreted. There are situations, though, where an emergency procedure can allow for immediate passage of an ordinance or a resolution. The other thing the charter calls for is for the city council to elect the city clerk. This is right in the charter, for 3-year terms with a no term limit. The next part is the mayor, and under the charter, the mayor is the sole holder of the executive power with a term of 4 years, no term limit. And the mayor has the right to appoint all department heads and most of the municipal boards, subject to the council approval. There's a couple of boards that that the mayor does not appoint. For example, the Community Preservation Committee, the council kept that one all to itself. And so they appoint the 4 what are called public members, but the mayor effectively appoints the 5 that come from the specific commissions in the city that are required, like the Historical Commission and the Conservation Commission. So it really is kind of jointly appointed by the mayor, although she doesn't specifically appoint them to the CPC. That's the right of the organization itself, the commission itself. The mayor has the right to call special meetings of the council, and the mayor can be asked to attend a city council meeting, although when she's asked to attend, she has the right to send a department head or her delegate. She doesn't have to necessarily come herself. The charter also lays out that she has 10 votes to veto a council action. And if she doesn't do anything after 10 days, the proposal passes. So it's she doesn't actually have to sign it if she doesn't want to. And I've seen a few things where it just goes to her office and she keeps it. That doesn't change the fact that it's become law. The other, but when she does veto something, the council can overrule that veto with a 2/3 vote. There's special rules. They've got to hold it for a certain number of days before they can actually have the vote. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the school committee, even though we didn't spend a lot of time on it. But there are some interesting differences in Waltham's way it treats the school committee, as you'll see when we get closer to the end of the presentation. First of all, the mayor is the chair. She's a voting member. So the school committee is made up of 7 people, but only 6 are specifically elected to the school committee. And they have 4-year terms that are staggered so that you end up voting periodically for half of them. Again, no term limits. And their duties include, under the charter, the selection of the superintendent. This is an interesting one in that, according to the charter, they have 2 options. One is that they need to appoint the superintendent annually, but They also reference a state statute which allows the school committee to appoint the superintendent for a term of up to 6 years. And despite the fact we've had a lot of superintendents, they're really using that second, that they're appointing for a longer term. One of the things we've all seen is the initial approval of all school buildings, and any alteration to a school building has to start at the school committee, even though it may require the approval of the city council and the mayor. There's a few other clauses in the charter. It lays out the rules for nominations, for preliminary ballots, and for elections. Basically saying we have preliminary ballots if and when there are more than 2 people for every single open slot. So if there's a ward open, it would they use a preliminary ballot if there's more than 2 people running. The idea is to get to 2. And if there, say we're 6 at-large positions open, if there are more than 12 running, you have to go to a preliminary ballot, even if it's just that there's 13. Couple of other things that are in the charter is it lays out what happens if you make a charter change. That there are certain things that want to make clear that they just didn't end because you had a new charter. Things like the existing ordinances stay in place. And we, in our study, we looked at the city now of Framingham, who wrote a very extensive charter a few years back when they became a city. And they have in the back of their charter must be 5 or 6 pages of things that of transitional rules that were laid out because they were going from a town to a city. When Waltham adopted its charter, it was just very simple language that everything pretty much remained in place. A couple of other things that you'll see in the charter would be how to, the actual language of the oath of office, the taking of property by eminent domain, some rules around employees having any financial interest in the city contracts, but basically they can't. A requirement for capital improvement, and rules for adoption or change in the zoning ordinances. The last part we're going to deal with is the initiative and referendum petitions, but one of the things you should notice is some of the things you don't see in the charter. There's nothing in here about what the departments of the city are. It doesn't mention a Department of Public Works or a planning department or housing department. That's all laid out by the city later, very often under rules that are laid out by the state. We did not spend significant time in dealing with it, but it is important to know that the charter doesn't lay that out. It's just silent on it, except to mention that it knows that there will be departments and that the mayor gets to select the heads of those departments, and the city council gets to approve those nominations. But the detail just isn't there. That's almost all in the ordinances. One of the things that I think is kind of important for people to understand is, well, we have a city council and a mayor and a school committee that can lay out ordinances and rules and lay out different things. We're not, as citizens, we're not stuck with just waiting between elections. If there's something we want or something we want to get rid of. The charter allows for petitions of the to the council or to the school committee as is appropriate. to compel measures to be taken. They're not easy, and that's what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. Basically, an initiative petition, is where a group of citizens want something to be passed, some kind of measure to be taken by either the council or the school committee. And there's two ways to do it. And the speed with which you do it is somewhat dependent on how many people you get to sign up on the petition to get this change. There's one method where you get at least 15% of registered voter signatures. And in Waltham, where we have about 35,000 registered voters, that would take about 5,250 registered voters to get a 15% of that group. But as you probably all know, if you want to do a petition, you don't get the 15% because you know that the clerk's office will go through the list and there will be people who weren't registered, thought they were, just signed, maybe didn't even live here. And so you always want to get a lot more. The second choice is if you can get to at least 8% of the registered voters, which in this case would be about 2,800 signatures. If you get 15%, you get to have a special election on that measure within 60 days of the submission of the petition, unless you're within 120 days of election day, in which case you have to wait. So, you know, if you were in the first year after the council was elected, you might choose to go with 15 if something you really wanted to get done right away. Whereas if you were in the second year, you might be satisfied with the 8% because you might be closer to that 120 days. But that's not the only hurdle. You have to then have, if you have the special election, or if it even goes with the regular election, 1/3 of registered voters must vote, and the matter must win the majority of that 1/3. And when you consider that Waltham, I believe, only had 37% of its voters come out for the last mayoral election, I believe, getting to that is not always going to be easy. And a special election might be even more difficult. So those would be some of the things you would want to consider if you ever wanted to go with a citizen petition. There's another way out, and that is if the school committee or the city council listens to you, they take the petition and they accept it, and they make the change that you asked for. Without any change to it, there's no public vote. But who cares? You won. You got what you needed. There are also, by the way, similar rules if something happens, the initiative petition is passed and there's another group of people who hate it. But similar to trying to get it passed, you've got to use similar rules to get out of it. There is something also called a referendum petition. And that's where the city council might have passed a measure, or the school committee, and you hate it and you want to protest it. This one may be even tougher to do, but it's available to you. And that is to file a petition within 20 days of the passage. But it's got to be signed by 12% of the registered voters to stop the measure from taking effect. So that'd be about 4,200 voters. And you know, you'd have to do more to make sure you met the 12%. And it requires the body that you're petitioning to reconsider the issue. And then if it's not rescinded by them, the clerk can submit the measure to voters in either a special election or the next regular municipal election, but that's at the clerk's discretion. It's not at yours as the petitioner. And again, you've got to get a majority of people voting for the measure for it to be effective. So it's an interesting way that citizens can affect change. And it's been used. The last time that it was used was when the Community Preservation Act was approved in Waltham. Citizens got together, got all the petitions signed, got it on the election. It was actually voted at the regular election for the city city officers, and it passed by, I believe, 5 votes after they did the recount. But that's the last time I know of anybody using citizen petition. The interesting thing is, in order to take and repeal the CPC, you'd have to use the same process. Last thing that can happen, but this is where the city council or the school committee wants to understand how the public feels. And they can ask the public to vote or reject something, to adopt something. And it could be at a special election or a regular election. But it requires 1/3 of registered voters to vote. And again, the majority have to vote in favor of it. With voting having at local elections being at such a low percentage, you probably wouldn't use a special election for this unless it's really critical. There. There are some, I just wanted to mention really briefly the important dates in Waltham. That it became a city in 1884, and in 1918, a little over 100 years ago, we adopted what is called the weak mayor city manager form of government. It's interesting that our form of government, Form B, is often referred to as weak mayor, but it doesn't seem to be the case because the mayor does have substantial authority in running the city. So I'm not sure how Plan B got to be called a weak mayor, but I think it's because there are such a preponderance of councilors where you have both at-large and ward councilors. But with the duties that were given to the mayor in our charter, clearly the mayor is not weak. The charter was changed again in 1923 and again in 1946. But then there was a small change in 63, but basically to bring it into compliance with state laws. And our charter, as it turns out, makes references to certain statutes where the statutes have been repealed, usually replaced by something else. For example, there were several references to open meetings, but the state has a very strong open meeting law that's applicable. So while the statute controls the charter, the fact that the charter's reference is incorrect and doesn't exist anymore, it's really not terribly relevant because the state's going to control open meeting rules. And in fact, very recently changed the open meeting rules to meet the virus to allow for Zoom type meetings, etc., so that you don't have to have meetings in public in the usual sense of what's in public. Then the last, there was a small one late in the 60s, increased the number of councilors, and then 86 is the last time that the charter was updated. And it was interesting, in looking at the charter, it says that it was approved by the legislature and signed by the governor in June of 1986, and then voted by the citizenry in 1986. am not certain, it's not clear to me, but it looks like maybe the citizens voted on it in Waltham after the legislature approved it, but I haven't been able to determine that for sure, because they may have done it by special election. But in that review, there were a number of proposed changes to the charter. There was some issue, and it happens today, where very often, you have somebody who's on the Board of Survey and Planning, they retire from it, or they don't retire, they have a term, say they have a 3-year term, and nobody gets around to reappointing them. And so the question was, well, do they still have authority? So one of the changes was to say that if you're on one of those committees and nobody's reappointed you and nobody's told you you're out, you continue. There was a discussion about term limits, eliminating counselors' salaries. Imagine that went over really well. Taking the mayor off the school committee, hiring a city manager, and a bunch of other issues. What happened, it was pared down substantially before it ever went to approval by the city and by the legislature. The main purpose, I've been told by some people who actually served on the Charter Commission, was to increase the mayor's term from 2 years to 4 years. Because running every 2 years, I've heard certain city councilors would love to change the term for city councilors from 2 years to 4 years, because they get tired of running for office, I think, every other year. It had a few more terms that basically, if this mayor didn't do anything within a time frame, that the city council could make an appointment. There was no provision to cover what would happen if a school committee member left, say after a year or two. So that was covered. And there was also the creation of capital improvement funds and the ability, as we discussed earlier, for the city council to require city officers or board members of commissions to appear within 48 hours. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other charters we looked at. While we were doing our study, Newton was looking at having a new city charter. They set up a charter commission, and they had apparently significant numbers of public meetings, several years of work, and their proposals were rather interesting. They had a huge city council. Theirs was at 24. They had changed the name from alderman to city council without the charter change, which I believe was allowed. But they proposed to go from 24 members down to 12, with 4 at large and 8 as ward councilors. But the interesting part in theirs, unlike Waltham, where the ward councilor is elected in the ward by the people living in that ward, Newton suggested, well, why don't we have all the ward councilors elected citywide, because a ward councilor affects activities all around the city. But, so why should we have it just be the ward people who actually get to vote? But it was clear that it would then be the ward councilor's responsibility to represent their ward. They also proposed to put term limits on the mayor and on the city councilors. It turned out that the proposal went down to defeat, and so there was no change in their charter. I believe, based on the signs that I saw in Newton driving around at that point, it was primarily because the people were not comfortable with ward councilors being elected citywide. I think what they figured is, well, if they're going to be elected citywide, they're not going to represent my specific interests in my ward. And so it went down to defeat. And to the best of my knowledge, they haven't come up with a different version. As we mentioned earlier, we looked at Framingham, and Framingham had been a town forever. I think it was the biggest town in Massachusetts. And they went with using more recent models. They also used the Collins Center at UMass, which helps governments with specific issues. And they have helped other cities with building charters. Their charter is a whole lot bigger than most. Their charter is, I think it's about 68, 64, 65 pages long. And ours, as I mentioned, is 15. Others are pretty short as well. Some shorter than ours, some a little bit longer. But they had a lot of clauses and a lot more detail. They, for example, have all the detail of laying out all of their city departments in their charter. They also have some interesting rules around campaign finance and ethical standards and transparency rules. They have a chief operating officer that's required, that their minutes have to be published 5 days after meetings, which would be kind of interesting, since they wouldn't then be approved before they're being published. There's also a mandatory review of the charter every 10 years. So ours, we only look at the charter when we get up the public will to do it. And it could be 100 years between charter changes or longer. But theirs every 10 years. The other thing is our charter says that if there's a raise in the mayor or the council or the school committee's salaries, actually I don't think the school committee gets any, but the council salaries, you can't get it this year. You have to wait till next year before that salary raise, salary increase is effective. Their charter actually lays it out in detail, which seems fairly restrictive. Let me go back for a second. One thing that's interesting is if you do a charter, I was of the impression that they put too much detail in and that they basically hamstrung the city for 10 years. Our charter and those of a lot of the cities that we looked at were much more general, much more like a constitution in laying out a framework, not the detail. And so it's an interesting thought. We talked to the people in Newton who were involved with the Newton charter change, the proposed charter change, and they said they really felt they wanted to keep it general. They didn't want a lot of detail. They thought it gave the city much more flexibility. So if the city of Waltham ever decides to make changes to the charter and sets up a charter commission, it'll be an interesting philosophy discussion as to what do we try to achieve.
Diana, there's one question I think is appropriate right now. Joan asked if there are items in the charter that are being ignored, and are some really outdated?
I don't know of any that are being ignored. There's a few that are outdated in that there's references to statutes that don't exist anymore. They're references to state statutes that and I think also the notice requirements that are outdated, where it seems to require a newspaper, a print copy of a newspaper to put a notice in if you're going to have an ordinance that needs to be published a week before the meeting, or a special permit where you have to I think give notice twice before the special hearing, the public hearing. there are some things like that that are a little bit out of date. Because it's so general, the rest of it's still pretty effective. It's really a question of, do you like the terms? And I think maybe looking at the comparisons where we see how other cities have done it, maybe we'll give some other thoughts. For example, term limits. Some cities have them, most don't. But those are kind of some of the issues we have. But I hope that answers Joan's question. Let me go on. These are comparisons of the cities. We looked at Waltham, Framingham, Woburn, and Somerville. We were looking for cities that weren't the real big ones. We didn't think Cambridge and Boston would be particularly helpful. And we actually, we probably should have looked at Watertown, but like most people, we thought Watertown was a town. Watertown is called a town, but it's a city. So we looked at it a little bit, but we'd already looked at these. And these are some of the comparisons that all of those cities have elected mayors. But one other thing that we looked at was there's something called the Model Cities Charter. And this is I think a nonprofit that works on good government issues, and they've issued ideas around how a city should be governed. And it's not specifically for Massachusetts, it's, you know, countrywide that their proposals and ideas are laid forward. And they think the better form of city government is to have a city manager as opposed to a mayor who actually runs the operations of the city. They allow for a mayor, but they really like a city manager. And like I said, I know of a few places where they have city managers in Massachusetts. The city of Chelsea, for example, uses a city manager. As part of the model cities, they also think that then the city council would select the city manager. So who elects, it selects the chief executive? Well, the public. In the cities we looked at, the city council, when it's not a mayor, elects or selects the city manager. The terms, Waltham has 4 years, Framingham has 4, Woburn and Somerville are 2 years. Whereas a city manager depends on the life of the contract, what the term of the contract is. So we have no term limits. Framingham allows for 3 consecutive terms. It's interesting, Newton also looked at going with a term limit of how many terms consecutively that a mayor could run for. That didn't mean that they couldn't then take a break for the next term and then come back. It's not like the president, who gets 2 terms maximum, and that's it. It's not like somebody could come back and run for a 3rd term after a break of 4 or 8 years. Woburn has no term limits, Somerville has none, and they don't have city managers. The legislative comparisons, it's interesting how the differences in the sizes of councils. Ours is one of the bigger ones, with 15 members, 6 at large, 9 ward councilors. Framingham only has 2 at large and 9 councilors. Woburn has 2 at large and 7 ward councilors, and Somerville 4 at large and 7 ward or district. Framingham calls them districts. Everybody else uses ward. And the model city said 5 to 9 councilors total, which is a much smaller number than any of these 4 cities have used. For the terms, it's interesting that we have 2-year terms. Framingham, it depends. If you're at large, you get a 4-year term. If you're a district councilor, you have to run every 2 years. And then Woburn and Somerville are 2 years. It's interesting, the model city said, go with 4 years. Term limits, only Framingham has as term limits. Basically, their limit is 12 consecutive years in either position, either as at-large or ward. And nobody else has them. As I mentioned, we did look at the school committee. I did this kind of after the group finished our work, just because I had the time, and wanted to look at what are the differences in how school committees are laid out. And I was primarily looking at how the mayor was involved in the school committee, because that was one of the proposals in the 1986 charter change, one of the proposals that didn't go very far, which was to take the mayor away from the school committee. And it's interesting, Waltham has the mayor as a full member of the school committee. Framingham and Somerville allow the mayor to come sit there as ex officio members, and Woburn allows the mayor to attend. And then when it comes to voting, Waltham, as far as I know, she has the right to vote. There's nothing to prohibit her from voting. But Framingham, it's only if there's a tie. And the other two cities, the mayor doesn't get to vote. The other interesting thing about Somerville is that not just the mayor is ex officio member of the school committee, but the council president is as well. Next question was the mayor as chair. Our charter says the mayor is the chair. Framingham says, no, not the chair, not the vice chair. Woburn said, well, the mayor could be allowed to preside, but the president of the school committee is actually the one who would normally preside, but if they choose to have the mayor preside, that's fine. And some, not at all. The number of members of the school committee is different than the council, in that Waltham has a smaller number of members. In that we have 7 members, only 6 elected to that position directly. Framingham has 9, Woburn has 9, and Somerville has 7. And our terms are the longest. 4-year terms for the school committee, 2 years for Framingham, 3 years for Woburn, and 2 years again for Somerville. The interesting one was Framingham. All the rest, actually it's not just Framingham, but 2 cities, Waltham and Woburn, the school committee is just elected within the whole city. Whereas Framingham, it's by district, and Somerville is by ward. So a school committee represents a specific ward, which is very different than our situation. And then the last kind of comparison is the year of adoption. Ours was adopted in 1986, as we've been talking about. It's fairly short. Framingham's just 2 years ago. It's 57 pages without the transitional pages. Woburn has a 36-page charter, but what's interesting about their charter is it has the current charter provisions, and then it has the history of the charter provisions as they've changed, because Woburn has amended their charter over time, but they haven't rewritten it as a new charter. And the same is true of Somerville, although Somerville only shows the current provisions of the charter. And the only one requiring a mandatory review is Framingham. Lastly, I just wanted to mention what some of the thoughts were we had when we got all done with this project. That we came to the thought that the charter is often used as a reason for why Waltham cannot do something. And I don't know if it's a lack of education on what the charter has in it, or if it's an excuse because people don't want to make the change when they do understand the charter, but it comes up periodically. Oh no, we have to change the charter, which is a big deal because it usually takes a while and involves the charter commission as a general rule and a whole lot of voting. And so it wouldn't be a small thing to change our charter. There's also some topics that might be worth considering if we were to ever do a change in the charter. For example, the campaign finance law or the mandatory charter review, things like that that Framingham has in it might be useful to think about. But as I said earlier, the charter is very general, and we kind of thought that was probably a good idea. That going to the detail that Framingham did was not, was probably not in, would not be in our best interest to do. So that basically finishes the presentation. And I'm happy to take other questions. Do I have to unshare?
No, that's taken care of already.
Oh, you did that. Okay.
Okay. No questions have been entered. Let's just wait a second or two. I saw that Deb was also on the
Oh, good.
in the audience, and I want to thank her as well as you for doing all the work on this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. For those who couldn't see the whole recording or the whole presentation, it is being recorded, and as soon as I have a chance to look through it and edit it, I will share it with everybody. So Pat wants to know, what are the next steps?
Oh, Patrick did make it. Well, this is more to inform. I mean, basically, the League of Women Voters wanted to make sure people understand what's in the charter. We are not taking a position saying it ought to be adjusted or changed, because you can't really have that discussion until people understand what's in the current charter. So it's more to make that we're looking at this as being an educational process. Does that help you, Patrick?
I can imagine he's shaking his head. Yes, got a couple more questions here. He said
Sure.
yes.
Oh, okay, good.
In fact, he said yes. Thank you and yes. Okay, then, unless there are any other questions, I want to thank you all for spending the evening with us. And I'm just making sure I've got everything, all the I's dotted and T's crossed here. And again, it will be edited and put up on our Facebook page and on our website as well. I want to thank you all very much, and special thanks to you, Diana, and to Deb and the others on the committee who did such fine work.
Oh, thank you.
Have a great evening, be well, and stay safe.